Section 4.3 is going to cover a few different types of sampling and survey methods. In the last section, we talked about why it was important when conducting a sample to select people at random rather than having them opt in or selecting them by convenience. This helps eliminate bias. However, even when we use that randomization process, there are still some potential sources of bias. For example, some samples are done by randomly calling landline telephones, which excludes people that only use a cell phone or don't have a phone at all. This sample would likely suffer from what's called undercoverage, where certain members of the population are less likely or cannot be chosen for the sample. When we think about this particular example, which subsets of the population would be less likely to be chosen when we're calling only landline telephones? I can say I don't have a landline telephone anymore. I think that's true probably of many of the people in our class. And it's also probably true that people who do have a landline telephone are more likely to be older. So older residents, older subjects, their responses are going to be overweighted, and younger subsets, younger people, are going to be underweighted since they're not included in the sample. Let's look at another example. How long before school starts do students get out of bed on average? Administrators survey a random sample of students on each school bus one morning. Describe how undercoverage might lead to bias in this study. Is the average amount of time in the sample likely greater than or less than the average for all students at the school? So again, we have our sample, which is the random sample of students on each school bus. And we have our population, which is all students at the school. Okay, when we take that sample, we ask them this question: how early do you get out of bed? They give us a response. All right, that's going to be a statistic because it's based on a sample. We're trying to estimate a parameter, the true average amount of time that students get out of bed early. Now, this is going to be biased because the students who take the bus probably have to wake up earlier than other students, the ones who are driving, walking, etc. All right, and because this sample only includes those students who take the bus, all right, there's going to be undercoverage of all those other students, the walkers, the drivers, etc. Now, even if every member of the population is equally likely to be selected for a sample, not all of them are equally likely to actually provide a response. So let's continue with that example from before where we're calling those telephone numbers. And let's say we're randomly dialing all numbers now, not just landline numbers. So hopefully that will reduce that undercoverage issue. Still, when we call these numbers, some people might not respond. Okay, why might that be the case? There's really a number of reasons. So to start, some people will probably ignore any numbers that they don't recognize. Others might be busy with work or taking care of kids. All right, main issue being that anyone that we call that doesn't answer or hangs up when we do answer is giving a non-response, okay, which is another major source of bias in these surveys. When we're talking about a non-response bias, this occurs when an individual chosen for the sample can't be contacted or refuses to participate. Now, if the people that are refusing to participate are just random, that's not an issue. When it becomes an issue is when the people who are refusing to participate are all similar in some way, and they're different from the population, the overall population, in ways that would change the outcome. Okay, maybe it's because they're working versus retired, or they have kids versus not have kids, and those outside variables would affect the response to those survey questions in the same way it's affecting their ability to respond to it at all. As an example here, 300 people participated in a free 12-week weight loss course at a community health clinic. After 1 year, administrators emailed each of these 300 participants to see how much weight they had lost. 56 participants responded. The mean weight loss was 13.6. Remember, we show averages by having that little bar over the variable there. How might non-response have led to a bias in the survey? Well, they sent this survey to 300 people. Only 56 responded. All right, the people who were most likely to respond were probably the people that are most proud of their yearly results. So in other words, they're more likely to have lost a fair amount of weight. Okay, now that said, this sample is likely to produce an average that's greater than the mean for all 300. Anybody who gained weight or stayed flat may have been too embarrassed to respond. It can be kind of tricky to distinguish between a voluntary response bias and a non-response bias. Remember, a voluntary response bias happens when people are opting into the survey. A non-response bias, on the other hand, can only occur after a sample has been selected. So ideally, there's been some kind of randomization in identifying our subjects. Once we ask them the question or attempt to ask them a question, if they don't respond, that's when it becomes a non-response bias. We've covered a number of different biases at this point. Some of them happen when we're selecting our sample, namely convenience bias, convenience samples, or voluntary response bias. Some of them happen when we're actually collecting our data, such as undercoverage and non-response. And then this last one happens when we're actually conducting the sample itself, doing the actual questioning. So characteristics of the interview, wording of the question, a lack of anonymity. There's a number of different factors that can lead to what's called a response bias. And this occurs when there's a consistent pattern of inaccurate responses based on the way that we're asking this question. Let's look at people's opinions on whether or not cheerleading is a sport. Haley surveyed students at her school on this question. 80% said yes when she was wearing a cheerleading outfit. When she was dressed in regular school clothes, only 28% said yes. That's a big difference there. And what we see here is a response bias. Something in the way this question is being proposed to these subjects is affecting their responses. Obviously, in this case, it's the fact that she's wearing her cheerleading outfit. They're more inclined to say yes because they don't want to offend her, where if she's just dressed in normal clothes, they're more likely to give their honest opinion. To wrap up this section, we'll look at one more example. What percent of Americans wash their hands after using the bathroom? In a telephone survey of 1,006 adults, 96% said, yes, I always wash my hands. An observational study of 6,028 adults in public restrooms showed that only 85% of those observed washed their hands. Why are these results so different? It's because of response bias. They're going to be embarrassed to admit to not washing their hands, even if they don't do so every time.